Our Fresno meeting of the Cannabis Advisory Committee, actually the last scheduled meeting of the year that we have on schedule. I'd like also, in addition to our Bureau colleagues who are here, we are also joined today by Mirren Klein from the California Department of Public Health, and also Richard Parrott from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, right over here. So they are here and present today. And we will now call to order and establish quorum.
Boboyan, Cermak, Clifford,
Here.
Dombrowski,
Here.
Farrow,
Here.
Heidelbach Teramoto,
Here.
Harada,
Here.
Huffman, Jacobson, Leff,
Here.
Lynch, Nevedal, Nikita,
Here.
Peck,
Here.
Ron, Stevenson,
Aquí.
Sweeney,
Here.
Todd,
Here.
Williams,
I gotta go.
Woolsey,
Here.
Wu,
Here.
you.
Here.
Quorum is established.
Okay, thank you. Also, I just want to note that apparently we can have a maximum of 7 of these microphones on at a time. So we shouldn't all yell at once. And we should, I guess, be conscious of turning them off when we're not speaking so we don't reach our maximum capacity. Shouldn't be a problem, I don't think. The second thing is I just wanted to sort of see a raise of hands if there were people who anticipated leaving early, because we're actually, in addition to you, because Ms. Yu's leaving at 1, is that correct? And I think we have a cushion of about 2 members for quorum. So is there anyone else who's going to, okay.
What's early going to be? I need to leave like at 3:30. I don't know how long we're going to go.
Okay, so 3:30.
Yeah.
I'm 3:30 as well.
Okay, so we have, until about 3:30, we're losing quorum, so we'll aim to be done by then. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first, or the second order of business after call to order is to the review and approval of the August 20th, 2018 Cannabis Advisory Committee meeting notes.
I do. Are we taking comments?
Yes.
So there is one item I know that I was quoted on. I just wanted to make sure that I think an important part of it was left out. Probably doesn't mean much, but let's see. I marked it. Of course, it's a big document. It was on page 15. It was my first comment, second comment from the bottom. And it had to do with cities not putting into effect the intent of Local 64. And if I recall, it's been some time, the comment was predicated on the fact if their city had a majority of its constituents vote for it, they should or would probably be voted out. Or I think it was they should be voted out. I just saying that they should be voted out because 64 passed doesn't really reflect the concern that a lot of our elected officials were raising. But if they're elected officials, and the point of the conversation was that if their elected officials voted for it, doesn't matter whether they won their office by 1 vote, a majority of people, even if it's narrow, voted for a robust commercial industry. And so that was my comment, and it should include that in it.
Okay, so I believe you can either make a motion to approve the minutes with an amendment, or you could make a motion to amend the notes.
Well, what I'd prefer to see if anybody else had any motions that they wanted modified before I make a motion.
Okay, so we'll continue discussion and
Sure,
then
and
we
then
can.
if we get to that point, I'll make a motion with the modification.
Perfect. Other comments about the notes or discussion? I don't see any.
So I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes with the following modification, that on page 15, Committee Farrow comment be modified to say, in towns, and adds if elected officials in these jurisdictions are not allowing businesses to operate as 64 allows and their constituents voted for it, they should be voted out by their residents.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Sorry, who was that?
It was
you say what happens
Matt
to
Clifford.
Sorry?
Matt Clifford. So now we move to a vote, right? Okay, so we'll now move to a vote. Oh, right, is there, right, I'm sorry. Public comment on the approval of the notes with the amendment. Okay, then if there's no public comment, we will move to a vote.
Boboian,
Aye.
Clifford,
Aye.
Dombrowski,
Aye.
Pharaoh,
Aye.
Heidelback Terremoto,
Aye.
Harada,
Aye.
Leff,
Aye. Aye.
Nikita,
Abstain.
Peck, Stevenson,
Aye.
Sweeney, Todd,
Abstain.
Woolsey,
Aye.
Wu, you.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to the third agenda item, which is the review and approval of the September 20th, 2018 Advisory Committee meeting notes. Is there any discussion? Are there any motions?
Member Nikita, I move to approve the meeting minutes for September 20th.
Second.
This is Leff, I second.
Okay. Is there any public comment on the September 20th notes? Okay, speaker one.
Hi, I'm Paul Hansberry. I was there at the meeting, and I do recall there was one commenter that asked a question about the restrictions on the hours of operation, and she was specifically asking about the 2 hours, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 p.m., and I believe council said that they were just talking about the regular hours of operation. Everyone left with the impression that that was just the regular hours of operation and not a requirement that someone, a staff member, be present Monday through Friday for a specified 2 hours, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And I don't even see the comments in the minutes. And I'd like to get some clarification on that. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Susan Tibbin. Just to flesh out or give a little more background to the previous comment, insisting that there be an owner or staff member on site, particularly when we're looking at rural locations, for a rural farmer who's doing everything from seed to finished topical to all the other things that need to be done on a farm, as well as just living life. And that small operator may not have the wherewithal to have an employee to be there for those designated 2 hours. So it's really a very onerous requirement, particularly when we're looking at rural locations. Thanks.
Mr. Sweeney?
Yes, what I would suggest is that we note the fact that some of the rural areas are looking for some flexibility, and then I would suggest we call the question.
Mr. Nikita?
I have no personal recollection of that discussion from the prior meeting, and so if others do, I'm fine with that. But I think it goes without saying, as Mr. Sweeney said, that the rural people who represent rural farmers have asked us to build in flexibility into the regulations, and so I have no issues with making that notation.
Okay, so do you want to amend your
I will
motion?
amend the motion to approve the minutes for September 20th with an additional notation that, those representing rural farmers have asked for additional flexibility built into the regulations for their particular circumstances.
Okay, thank you. And you second?
I'll accept the amendment.
Okay, great. Then let's move to a vote.
Baboyan.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Farrow.
Aye.
Heidelback Terremoto.
Aye.
Harada.
Aye.
Leff.
Aye.
Nikita.
Aye.
Peck.
Aye.
Stevenson.
Aye.
Sweeney. Todd.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Woo. You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, we will move on to agenda item 4, which has 3 subparts, which is the discussion and possible action on the advisory committee's annual report. I want to first say one thing about process. It's my understanding this is the last meeting we have, and we're obligated under the statute to issue the annual report by January 1st, I believe. Is that correct? Tamara? By January 1st. So this will be our last chance to discuss the annual report as a group, and then any discussion today will move forward, or approval today will move forward with, possible changes, but will be published on January 1st. So just a process point there. And then second, before we like to start, I would like to really give a lot of thanks to our committee members, Ms. Yu and Ms. Nevedal, and also Mr. Bolbian and Dr. Cermak, who's not here, for taking on the task of putting together the draft of the report, which I know is a lot of work, and also the staff at the Bureau, who I know put a lot into working on the report and helping ensure its accuracy and pulling it together. So thanks for all the work that went behind the scenes from our last meeting to this meeting. Okay, so the first subpart of this agenda item is the discussion and possible action to include recommendations of the microbusiness subcommittee in the annual report. So these are the recommendations we talked about last time, and this will be a discussion and possible action to include them as part of the annual report. And I think Mr. Farrow, I will ask you, I'll open it up to discussion, but maybe ask you to present these issues from the subcommittee and comment on their inclusion in the annual report. Okay, and also just to remind everyone that the subcommittee recommendations from the last meeting in September are in your packet, if you need to pull them out. Mr. Farrow?
Yes, I'm just reviewing.
Okay, great. Just take your time. I just want to make sure that you heard.
Yeah, no, I heard.
Yeah.
I'm trying to make sense of, I don't remember the recommendation being traditionally put in this format, but,
Okay.
so I'm trying to
Take your time. I think
recall
everyone can
on-
pull them out to review.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, so there was quite a bit of discussion at the meeting dealing with the micro business not being traditionally micro, and the discussion was to provide a micro businesses or a micro business A that would allow small businesses to operate more like small businesses, not businesses that were operating more like a vertically integrated business. And it was to be consistent with the 10,000 square feet of cultivation and allowing 3 out of the 4 other activities to be fulfilled by any type of non-volatile solvent manufacturing, in shared space manufacturing, retail sales to happen at events in addition to storefront sales and delivery and distribution. So we added to it the ability to do non-volatile solvent manufacturing, because a lot of the small farmers, because of the way they're currently operating, can't be licensed under the traditional land use, and then to allow event licensing to qualify for a sales type license. So that was recommendation number 1. Did we want to discuss that further or do we want to go to the next
I would
one?
maybe go through all of them, and then we can have the discussion about whether they should be included in the report, which I think is the action item.
Sure, and then the item number 2 was basically to develop a document that would be distributed that would allow local governments to understand that there's other ways that they could accommodate the micro business. For example, the same thing with the non-volatile solvent manufacturing, because many of the local authorities would say that they wouldn't meet all the standards of micro business manufacturing because of the solvent nature of extraction. So we wanted the Bureau and the California Department of Public Health to distribute a document to each one of these municipalities so they could make it more possible for these small operators to be licensed and be able to operate under the micro business license type. Under 3, the Bureau considered removing the prohibitions on activities that allow within the home, so long as the activities that the applicant is choosing to conduct are activities commonly allowed under cottage business. And so, for example, the discussions during this meeting where a lot of folks did baked goods at home or chocolates at home, and that under the current regs that came out, you couldn't mix cannabis business with a home location. So there was a recommendation on that as well.
Okay, so I guess I'll open it up for discussion on a possible action to include these recommendations as part of our annual report. Mr. Sweeney?
Yes, we should do that.
Do you have a motion?
So,
Yeah.
Perhaps I'll make a motion that those, the tripart recommendations be included in the overall report.
Okay. For a second? Okay.
I'll second.
Oh, got 2 seconds. Okay, Mr. Left?
No.
Dr. Left? Dr. Left. Okay, and so I'll open up to public comment. Oh, yeah, sure.
Just a comment from my perspective. I'm going to object to the inclusion of item 3, the home-based cottage industry addition. I understand why this recommendation is there. I don't think it's appropriate for our urban areas, and so I won't be voting no on this item.
I also have concerns with item number 3. You have state inspectors who are going to be tasked with inspecting and verifying compliance with laws that would be going to a private residence. I think you have problems when you have agents of the government trying to inspect commercial operations at a private residence. You have privacy concerns of other people who might be staying or living at the residence that would be impacted by the government trying to come and inspect the location. And then you have other concerns with the inspectors going to a location where they don't know what parts they can search, what parts they can't. It's very easy to use the non-commercial parts of the residence for purposes that can't be inspected, like if you had a commercial property. So I also would be opposing item 3 being included in those recommendations.
Okay. I wonder if we want to break them apart, like the motion, we want to break that one out, or I'm just putting out there, vote on all 3 of them together, or vote on the item separately, or 1 and 2, and then separately 3. But if there's no, then let's.
I have no preference.
Okay, I'm not, if you want to amend the motion, do that or not. I'm just putting it out there.
Actually, I have a comment on that one.
Okay.
I would oppose that. I would want item number 3 included.
Okay.
The issue with the residents and living in there, whoever goes and gets the license from the Bureau, they would have to comply with the same requirements as dictated by regulation. Other residents living at the premises, they would be aware of what's going on anyway, and that's really a burden that's more on the person that's renting to whoever is inhabiting the premises. And I don't see any issues with leaving it in there, again, because they would have to go through the same process. They would still have to be licensed. It's not really a free-for-all to be able to conduct those activities without a license. So if you're going through the licensing process and everything's on the up and up, everything is, keyword is compliance. If they meet all those requirements, there's really no reason to leave this out.
Okay. Other discussion, or we'll move to public comment? Okay.
Can I just make one comment that recently passed legislation, SB, I think it was AB 626, actually allows for food to be produced and distributed at homes, and allows local environmental health agencies to inspect in those homes with some limitations.
If it would be easier for the group, it sounds like nobody's commented at items 1 and 2. Why don't we do 1 and 2 as a group, and then we'll do the other one separately.
Okay, it's Mr. Sweeney's motion, right? So do you want to move forward with your motion, or do you want to amend it?
I'm willing to amend the motion to deal with the first two, and then we can approach the last item separately.
Okay, great. And the second was Dr. Lafray?
I'll accept the amendment.
Okay, so we'll open it up to public comment. The motion is now, it's public comment on recommendation 1 and 2 for inclusion in the annual report.
I was prepared for number 3.
Okay, well, we will have public comment on that, I believe. But speaker 3.
Hello, good morning again, Susan Tibbin. I too have comments on item 3, which I'll hold off for now. But what I would like to share with the group is that not everybody may be aware that all the hair follicles and all the perspiration or sweat glands in our bodies contain what are called cannabinoid receptors. And so it's particularly important when we're looking at operators making value-added items like topicals, that we want to provide in every way possible a path for those operators, for those people, to continue activities that they've been doing, just sort of did a rough air math, sometimes for 4 and 5 decades, moving into second and third generations. So again, I just want to stress that particularly as the price of cannabis drops in the state of California, we need to be mindful that without making a path for value-added products, which usually are home-based, we're cutting out thousands of people who really want to be part of this program. They may not be here with us today, but we can assure you they are there, and they're just sort of holding their breath, hoping for that path to enter the market at the small level that they want to enter it. Thank you.
Paul Hansberry, regarding number 2, it looks like it says here that it's giving to create a document telling the local jurisdictions that they can be more restrictive. I'm fairly certain that they know that. The problem is that the bar is set so high that being more restrictive results in pretty much of a ban. And so lowering the minimum restrictions is what they're calling the minimum restrictions. I've done some research on what these, especially when it comes to security. That's 6 cameras at my home and my residence in my area there. 6 cameras with the requirements required for video at 24/7, 15 frames per second, high definition for 90 days, would take over 25 terabytes of storage. Now, for a small operator, that's unbelievable, unbelievably burdensome. So they can make it more restrictive, but the state needs to make it untie their hands so that they can make it more restrictive. The regulations right now, I don't know. I've talked with a number of different people, and they all agree that the restrictions here are more like you're treating cannabis like plutonium. Thank you very much.
Okay, then we'll move towards a vote on whether to add recommendation number 1 and 2 from the Microbusiness Subcommittee to the annual report.
Baboyan.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Barrow.
Aye.
Heidelback Terremoto. Aye. Harada.
Aye.
Leff.
Aye.
Nikita.
Aye.
Peck. Stevenson. Sweeney. Todd.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Woo. You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, so still on the same agenda item, do we have another motion, perhaps?
Yes, I am still pushing for the third recommendation. I understand the Assembly bill, which is still pushing for this third category. I recognize that there are thousands and thousands of small individuals in mostly rural areas. And I also recognize that reasonable minds may differ, and therefore I call for an aye vote. Thank you.
I'll second.
I didn't hear those. Okay, Mr. Boldian. Okay, we had some discussion, but further discussion on the motion? Okay, then we'll, yes.
Madam Vice Chair, I would just like to add that this recommendation is for the Bureau consider removing. So we are not recommending that the Bureau remove entirely. It's just the Bureau to consider this as a recommendation. We've heard from legacy operators who are seeking licensure in many of these rural areas, so I would urge us to vote aye on this as well. Many of these operators may not have access to the capital to increase their business outside the home. Thank you.
Okay, then let's move to, if there's no further discussion, move to public comment.
Before we start public comment up again, I'd like to make a couple of reminders. This is the advisory committee meeting for the Bureau of Cannabis Control. It's not a regulatory meeting, so we will be only taking public comment on the items on the agenda today. If you make public comments on the regulations, they're not submitted or counted towards the regulatory process. We are going through speaker 1, 2, and 3. When you see an open seat and like to submit public comment, please come and take a seat or wait in line for one to open. We're giving each public speaker 2 minutes to speak. Please wait for my announcement to speak and also make an announcement when your time is up. And with that, we'll move to speaker number 1, please.
Hi, I'm Paul Hansberry. The bill was AB 1616, which allowed cottage kitchens. It was implemented, went into effect in January of 2013, which allowed for home kitchens. Inspectors do go into the kitchens, into the private home. With regards to urban areas, there are you have to get a local permit first before you can get a state license. And that's screened first by the local jurisdiction. If they wouldn't allow it in a residential area, and I'm not proposing that they should, but what I am saying is that if you look at the SORIA for the Department of Public Health, you'll see that they have the state broken up into sections, and there's the top 3 sections represent all of Northern California, which is predominantly a rural area, and 60% of the cannabis grown in California is from these areas here, and they are all, for the most part, not all, for the most part, they are home-based businesses, businesses that are run out of their home. These are the people that started the industry. I believe that the Bureau was set up in order to we're tasked with setting up regulations for an established industry, not creating a new industry with the regulations. People doing things out of their home is essential. That's how they've always done it. As far as inspectors coming in, there's been building inspectors, there are cable people, there's all kinds of people that come into it. When you sign up for a license, you're allowing people, you're giving them permission to come into your home. I'm not saying it's appropriate for an urban situation, but for a residence in an urban or a rural situation, it is most appropriate. And it's how it's been done for generations. And that screening process would be done at the local level. So taking things and allowing operations to be performed out of the home is essential. And I understand some of the reasons why, with these cartels that went and bought 100 homes and started destroying them for indoor grows. These aren't the people that are going to be applying for license. Thank you.
Speaker 2.
Morning. My name is Ross Gordon. I'm with the California Growers Association. Would agree with everything that Paul just mentioned. We've been hearing more and more concern from our members over time in rural areas about the ability to use their home for these types of activities, especially as people come to realize how difficult some of the permitting requirements can be around separately built facilities on very rural farmland in terms of local land use. In terms of sort of the issue that's been raised about home-based businesses in urban areas, we definitely agree that that's not appropriate. But I feel like that's a local land use issue. I'm not aware of any city or suburb or anywhere besides very rural areas that would permit you to have any type of cannabis business based out of your home. I am fairly certain saying there are no local governments within the state that allow that. That said, in very rural areas, it is appropriate to have, say, topical manufacturing based in the home where it's traditionally been done. The other thing that I think is important to think about in relation to that is that, as far as I understand, the Bureau is the only agency that prohibits an activity being based in the home. So there's no prohibition that I know of from either DPH or CDFA from basing a commercial cannabis activity in the home. And I think it speaks to a larger point with some of the issues with the microbusiness license, that the microbusiness license, because it's administered under the Bureau, which understandably tends to have more of an urban perspective because more of the urban licenses fall under the Bureau, they tend to approach that from that perspective. But they also happen to administer the microbusiness, which is a license that heavily impacts cultivators and, as we've sort of discussed, was originally intended for the small cultivator. So I think this is one of several instances where a more rural thought process is important to keep in mind. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello again.
Sorry, hold on I'm sorry.
Yeah.
One moment, please. We will reset the time. Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Hello again, Susan Tibbin. As I've mentioned earlier, home businesses have been a mainstay of really thousands of small operators, particularly in rural areas. But because of geographic, zoning, and fiscal constraints, to not allow home business means that not only are we promoting the underground market, but we're making a severe and probably irreparable damage to small communities, particularly in Northern California. Home businesses are often legacy operators moving into their second and third generation who want to enter the legal market. They welcome inspections, much as home kitchens welcome inspections. They expect inspection and strict adherence to health and safety. Please be aware, as I think Paul said, that those who don't want or don't welcome inspections and are not willing to live up to the highest level of health and safety are never going to enter our program, and nobody wants them in the program anyway. By signing up for the program, you sign up for inspections. You sign up for ongoing education in terms of health and safety. So please be aware just how severe already the financial impact is to places like Leggett, Laytonville, Garberville, which are really struggling and don't welcome the underground market, but people feel caught because they need your help to be part of things. Thank you.
Thank you. Please reset the time. Thanks,
Tim Moreland, River Distributing, in strong support of Mr. Sweeney's motion. As a distributor, we want to allow these home businesses to be able to grow and to create great brands that we can ultimately sell in the retail market. As Susan and as Ross, and River's also a board member of CGA, so we're standing in unison with them as well on this issue. Frankly, the folks in these home businesses, I am from Elk Grove, California. I am from ground zero of some of these cartels buying homes and making them grows and doing all sorts of illegal activity. Those folks will never, ever be in the regulated system. They have no desire. I've actually been to Paul and Susan's property in Laytonville. This is the kind of properties we're talking about. These people have a desire to let the regulators come in and inspect these facilities. That is not the case with some of the other stuff going on, and frankly, that's a little bit out of our control. Hopefully, we'll get more enforcement and crack down on that. But highly in support of this measure. This is where brands are made. This is where all of the great brands in the cannabis industry have been made, and the big brands that River represents as a large distributor, they started out small at some point. Thank you.
Thank you. That ends public comment for this item.
Okay. Mr. Sweeney, did you?
Yeah. I move my previous recommendation.
Mr. Woolsey, did you have a comment?
I do have a comment. I just
Okay.
want to thank the public for their comments as well as my colleagues. And in reminding me that the local authority does have the opportunity to prohibit home operations, and I am actually able to support this now. Thank you.
I needed to add a big other comment? Okay, then we'll move to a vote. Oh. Okay.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm a registered nurse. I am a hospice palliative care nurse. Have done so for the last 19 years. Today is my first day in the forum to try to learn I care for the elderly. I am doing what I was born to do as a hospice nurse. As a hospice nurse, we are always looking for solutions to care for those that are dying. But we want to be able to do it in a safe manner. And for the last 20 years, sometimes with the ratio specific with the drugs that we have to have, and when you're that nurse that is holding that person, taking the last breath, and morphine is not cutting it, and different things are happening, we need other solutions. We need, just like food needs to be safe and all of that, we need better. I'm seeking knowledge and understanding because I used to be the very traditional nurse, morphine, 20 milligrams, blah, blah, blah. But now that I see that we have in our elderly population, there are other solutions that are viable. We need to maintain an environment that is safe, but we need to be able to create those pathways and to educate and empower people like me and the healthcare professional to help us understand, but to leave those pathways open to help us understand. Thank you.
Okay. So we will now move to a vote on adding on recommendation number 3, adding that to the advisory committee annual report.
Baboyan.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Farrow.
Aye.
Heidelback Termoto.
Aye.
Harada. Leff.
Aye.
Nikita.
No.
Peck.
Aye.
Stevenson.
Aye.
Sweeney.
Aye.
Todd.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Wu.
Aye.
You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, we will move on to the next sub-part of agenda item 4, which is discussion and possible action on the annual report writing subcommittee draft. And I'll open up to discussion, but I will ask Ms. Yu and Ms. Nevedal. Is Ms. Nevedal here? She's not here. Oh, then I will ask Ms. Yu to maybe present it a little bit first, and then we'll open discussion. Okay, the advisory, the draft is in everyone's packet. And it goes up to page 27 of the draft. And then the second part, which we're going to discuss subsequently, the overarching concerns, is the next subpart of this agenda item. So right now, we'll just be focused on the report part, which summarizes the work that we've done over the course of the year. So, Ms. Yu.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. I want to start by acknowledging the state licensing authorities for their leadership. And thank you, Bureau Chief Ajax, Director Parrott, Assistant Deputy Director Klein for being with us today. We would also like to thank the staff for their valuable support and everyone who engaged with the work of the committee. We'd also like to recognize the work we have completed as a committee. We took a meaningful look at pressing industry challenges and to the greatest extent possible, developed recommendations for solutions. And this was all done within an evolving regulatory environment on a wide range of issues. We hope that this report accurately reflects our discussions and the input we received from the public. So if we take a look at the report, The executive summary details California's path towards legalizing and regulating cannabis, the purpose of the committee, and the introduction of our 10 designated subcommittees. The background seeks to provide a high-level overview of cannabis legalization progress, the inherent challenges to regulating an industry that has not been federally decriminalized, and the challenges we face to balance regulating an existing industry without making it too burdensome as to perpetuate the illicit market. The report breaks down subcommittee recommendations by recommendations adopted by the subcommittee, or adopted by the full committee, recommendations tabled by the committee due to requiring statutory changes, and recommendations that failed to be adopted by the full committee. These recommendations are listed as adopted, partially adopted, or not adopted. We also include in here the informal presentations we received. We have a section open for unresolved issues, which will be discussed later, and a conclusion. And in the conclusion, we wanted to caution against taking a one-size-fits-all approach for California, and we want to emphasize learning from experience in this industry. And it's clear that there's a lot more work and issues that need to be sufficiently addressed, but we strove for this report to represent an important first step towards creating a more sustainable economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and for all your work on the report. So I'll open it up for discussion and comment.
I'd just like to, this is Keith Stevenson, thank Sonia Logman as well. Her name wasn't mentioned, and I didn't see it, so I know she's been an integral part of this body of work, and I want to publicly thank her as well.
If possible, we would be happy to add that onto the report, if that's amenable to the rest of the committee.
Amen.
I'm just going to say, I think we have two possible options on the report moving forward. We can adopt it specifically as written today, this portion of it, and have that be the annual report, or we can adopt it in concept, but then allow the Bureau and Matt and myself to make some further revisions. So like an addition like that, or if there's other revision, not conceptual things, but we adopt it in concept, but we can make further edits before it's finalized and published on the 1st. So I've just put those two possible options out there. Mr. Sweeney.
So what is your preference? The process has been to adopt in concept, so it allows some flexibility for revisions, and that would seem to be the preference in this case. Unless I hear otherwise, I'd be willing to make a motion to adopt under those circumstances up to page 27, and allowing for some flexibility for review and specific revisions.
Only thing I'd say is that there already is revisions required as a result of the adoption of the 3 items for micro business anyways.
Exactly.
So we know that needs to be incorporated in the final document. Generally speaking, the latitude, if we have an agreement on this document, is just to change words or things that are left out or grammar and things like that. It's not really intended to change the intent of the document. And so if that's the purpose, I'm fine with that. Okay.
And actually, I just wanted to clarify, it doesn't have to be, it would be the Bureau staff, and it doesn't have to be me and Matt who make the final edits. It can only just be 2 people of the committee. So it could still be it could be the subcommittee who drafted it, or if there's particular issues around one of the subcommittees, it could be those 2 people. So just clarification on that process.
And this document's due in January, correct?
January 1st, it has to be published.
But we don't have any other meetings on the schedule.
Correct.
So then that's my only concern, is that we would need to comb through, not for grammatical errors, but just to make sure that everything we discuss is obviously in there. When are we going to, or are we going to set time aside to go through it again? Or no? As is for January.
Yeah, this is either as is today for January or as is in concept, or presumably like we could strike out
I would
part of
support
it,
in concept.
and then add, I mean, I think it's very thorough, and I think a lot of the work that the staff of the Bureau did was to make sure that all the motions were accurate and it was detailed in terms of what is my understanding and the work that you all did. But yes, if we determine that there was an inaccuracy, then the Bureau and the two people working on it would be able to make those corrections. Yeah.
That's consistent with my motion.
Okay. And I was chatting, so was there a second?
I'll second.
I was getting advice.
In concept, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
To be accurate, I believe the report goes to 28, but it is, the global issues are included after 27, but right before 28.
Right. So the part we're voting on now is through 27, and the is that right? Oh, and then there's the conclusion. Okay, and the last page. Okay, so it's just we're gonna have a separate discussion about the global issues, which are stuck in between page 27 and page 28. So it's all numbered pages through 28. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Just my compliments to the drafters, and thank you also. Most of the drafters are not here today, I think, but.
Yeah, we have 50%.
Okay, and thank you to staff for supporting. I just had a question on the draft itself. For a lot of the recommendations that we made, and this is much appreciated, there's an implementation status, which is great. I'm curious because some of the times we say not adopted and there's a reason, and other times we say not adopted. Is there a rationale for when we give an explanation for not adopted versus when we just leave it as a two words? Is there clarification on that, or am I just asking too many questions here?
I don't know the answer to that.
Is this a question to staff or to the drafters? Do we know?
I don't know. Miss Yu, do you know?
I think
don't
in
have the document.
some of the sections you're referring to, most of the, I would say, recommendations that were not adopted would not have a section listed afterwards. If there is one, it may just have been listed to show that it was not adopted. But I mean, for consistency purposes, we could also remove that.
Well, I have no issues with the content. I'm just looking at the first two subcommittee under cultivators. It says implementation status for number 1, not adopted, and there's an explanation. Number 2 says not adopted. Number 6 says not. Number 2 says not adopted. Number 7 says not adopted with an explanation. And so I was just curious why. I was just curious here. I'm not proposing any changes. I just wanted an insight into the reasoning there.
If this is Jeff, I didn't bring my notes from prior meetings, but if you recall when we did this review some time ago, when we got our responses back to what we'd moved, some of them had an explanation from staff or agencies of why they didn't do it. Some were just simply not adopted, if I recall correctly. And that may be why. I don't know what documents you used to review from, but I do know that when we initially got some of the responses, when we asked for a kind of summary of the progress of our recommendations, we got some with notes and some without.
I mean, it is inclusive of that information that we received. It maybe is a little misleading, and it suggests that that's the reason why it wasn't adopted when we don't know why people voted. If there was a vote on it and people voted no not to adopt it, we don't actually know the reason why. Which doesn't say, it just includes that information we got from the agencies after.
Yes. And that was a question I had, because some of the areas say also partially adopted. What does partially adopted reference? And I'm just looking at the manufacturing.
Yeah, I think, if I may, I think that maybe all that's needed is an indication that this information came from the agencies themselves, so that it doesn't appear that we as advisory committee members are adding these explanations in there. And that's how I understood it, actually, as coming from the agency, but perhaps it just bears stating. And I think that's something we could approve in concept, consistent with Mr.
And just a clarity
Sweeney's.
that that's
Right.
the agency's statement.
Agency's response.
Yeah.
Tamara?
Just a quick notion on that, Ms. Yu. Oops, sorry. Ms. Yu, I don't know in terms of when you determined partially adopted, not adopted, if that was information from the licensing authorities or if that was also in certain circumstances information that you and Kristen did as you were doing the research and putting this together. So I think from a legal perspective, my comment would be for clarity, if it's not from the licensing authorities, but instead from your review of what the regs looked like and whatnot, we may want to not indicate, be careful about what we indicate to separate your work, say, from information that you receive from the licensing authorities.
So I would say it would be accurate to say that most of these recommendations in terms of implementation status, we took into account if there were comments from the agencies, we would put them on, and if there were certain recommendations that we saw that, we combed through the regulations ourselves and we put in, whether it was adopted, not adopted, or partially adopted. So we made that, we made that determination as well. I think for purposes of actually being a report, I would feel more comfortable if the agencies looked through and made sure that our statuses are indeed correct. So would it be possible for the agencies to go through one time just before the final publication to just make sure these statuses are accurate?
At least from the Bureau perspective, I think that's something we could do. It appears that the other two are nodding their heads, so.
Yes, we agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, we agree as well.
Okay,
We'll look at them.
great.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sweeney?
So I move the previous question.
Okay, and we had a second, right? Yes, okay. We will move to public comment.
And just a reminder, we're taking public comment on pages 1 through 27 and then the conclusion. The pages titled CAC Annual Report Overarching Concerns, we're going to be discussing that next. So please only comments dealing with pages 1 through 27 of the annual report and the conclusion. So if you have a public comment on this item, please come up and take a seat.
This is Tim Moreland, River Distributing. So I have just a point of clarification. We're commenting on any of these non-adopts on recommendations, page 1 through 27. Okay. So I'd like to comment on the distribution part of the subcommittee report. Couple issues. I'll try to do this fast. We're talking about, I think it's 0.2 variation rates. Would really want to push for a 15% variance rate on products. The reason being, if you're a distributor and you get products and they are R&D tested by a brand, they come in and they come in R&D tested, and then the distributor has to perform a state certified test on that and receive a passing COA. About 70% of those tests that we run fail for label claim. And this is over the 10%. And no offense to the laboratory system right now, but it is a mess. I had a product that was tested, an R&D test, 2 days before the state certified test, and the product came out with an 80% variance rate. And this is just on one product. This happens quite a bit. A 15% variance rate will reduce the amount of failed tests for label claims and therefore reduce the amount of stickering that a distributor has to do. If you come into River's distributing facility, we're having folks who make $22 an hour. We love our Teamsters workers, but they're stickering. They are stickering, and we could put them to better use doing other things.
I just want to clarify that right now we're doing public comment on the motion, which is about the advisory committee annual report and the adoption of it in concept.
Well,
And number 5 agenda item is, other comments.
I was confused,
about
sorry.
the regulations.
So I can comment what's in this report, that's what I'm doing. Should I do that now? Or?
I might be confused too. But I'm Thomas Gromas from High Sierra Analytics, and I'm the lab. I don't know if it talks to what he's talking about also, but there is a wide variation in samples methods that are used in the industry. I know that needs to be addressed. We're working on that. I saw some of these non-adopted. Is that what we can talk about now?
So like changing these numbers?
So right now the public comment is on the annual report and adopting the annual report and the accuracy of what's in that report, not on what they've already adopted their recommendations and they're reporting out in this report. So not necessarily about whether or not you agree or don't agree with those recommendations, because that public comment was held at the meetings where those recommendations were in fact adopted or not adopted. The final agenda item, public comment for items not on the agenda, you can comment on anything about the regs or the recommendations or anything, but right now we're talking about the annual report itself.
Okay, thank you.
Tim Moreland, River Distributing. Now that I'm clear on what I'm commenting about, unfortunately I'll have to object to this report. I do not agree with a variety of things that were not adopted, huge issues like variance rates, one license for a distributor with multiple distribution hubs around the state. This is a large state. Let's see what else. There were some major issues on distribution that just, for some reason, weren't adopted. They're huge issues that we're facing as distributors. We're not the only one. I wish there were more distributors here today. But these are huge issues, and some of the regs, the proposed amendments for the regs, have dealt with some of these issues or trying to deal with them, and I appreciate that, but there's still some very serious issues that we need to deal with to have a smooth distribution model in the state of California, because right now we simply don't have that, and it's very tough, and especially for some of those smaller distributors out there to actually make this happen. So for those reasons, I'll object to this report.
Hi, Paul Hansberry. I concur. I have to disagree with this report on a number of different levels from a number of different subcommittees, most especially with the microbusiness. There's a number of things, recommendations that were made across the board with microbusinesses. It included several different agencies, and they were not adopted, and the reason for not adoption was considered statutory. I think that it was more the interpretation of the statute than statutory, that the Bureau and the different agencies have stuck by their interpretation rather than having an open mind and looking at them and interpreting things that might be a little bit more, might break down a few more barriers for compliance and adoption. Thank you.
If you'd like to comment on this item, please take a seat. Come up and take an open seat. Thank you. Speaker 2.
Yeah, Thomas Gromas, High Sierra Analytics. I'd like to also not go along with some of these recommendations or also I'd like to have some of these recommendations put in. Testing and the research and development. I have a lot of clients that are very interested in doing the right thing for the health and safety of the state. They want to test their products beforehand, before they turn it into another product, before they spend a lot of time packaging, manufacturing, and things like that. Most of them are very interested in looking at pesticides, and I think that's something that we would want to encourage is this R&D testing, or we call it also pre-testing for all these different analytes that might cause health effects. And I would also agree with one of the other speakers that came up here and mentioned that the variance on some of these tests would reduce the burden and probably reduce the retesting and failures of some of these things without increasing the danger to the health and safety of Californians. A lot of those variants will come into the potency testing. I know that's an issue, And a variance of 10% versus 15%, I don't think would make a very, very large difference in the health and safety. And the ability of people that are not licensed to have their product tested. I know there's a lot of people that are new to this. They want a second check on their products to make sure that they're safe. I think that would be very important to allow people that are not licensed to be able to test their product at a lab, make sure that they're safe for consumption. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 1.
Susan Tibbin, thank you. I also see some real holes in this report. Overall, I want to thank the drafters because it is very, very detailed and obviously entailed a tremendous amount of work, which sort of begs the question. I seem to remember at many of our meetings over the past, it seems like a couple of years now, when we looked at equity, I remember the word legacy farmer being used. And I remember that was interwoven as an integral piece of being equitable for all players in the state. And yet that seems to be missing from this report. It's extremely distressing personally for us who for many years worked with people similar to a previous speaker, a registered nurse, providing ratio-specific medicines for palliative care, as well as other kinds of value-added products. So when we're looking at equity, it just seems incomplete. If both my memory serves me well as reviewing minutes from these many meetings that you have put so much work into. And I'm just afraid that equity piece doesn't reflect both the reality of small operators, particularly in the rural regions, as well as what went on in many of our meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 3, please.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to piggyback off of Mr. Nikita. The subcommittee section, page 12 on equity, there's quite a bit of places in the implementation status section that are not adopted as well. So it would be helpful to have clarification regarding that and rationale as to why those pieces are not adopted. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. That will end public comment.
Okay, let's move to a vote on the question of adopting in concept with allowance for technical edits to still happen the advisory committee annual report to be published on January 1st.
Before we go to a vote, I had a question.
Go for it.
Sorry. On the adopted and not adopted, is this, so is it on behalf of the CAC or is it on behalf of the Bureau? Because, for instance, on the distributor, the recommendations that we came up with were all adopted by the CAC, but then some of them were not implemented by the Bureau. So could we make a distinction between the CAC adopting and approving the recommendations even though the Bureau did not implement it?
Mr. Baboyan, to your point, the way we structure the report, I'm hoping this is helpful, it's by subcommittee recommendations adopted by the CACs, and then within each subcommittee, we break down all the recommendations and then the implementation status. And then we also have a section on tabled subcommittee recommendations requiring statutory amendments. And then we have the subcommittees listed, the recommendations within each subcommittees that was made, and then the implementation status. And then finally, we have subcommittee recommendations not adopted by the full Cannabis Advisory Committee, and then it breaks down that similar way as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Further, Mr. Woolsey, did you?
Yeah, just on that point, maybe for clarification, for the technical changes if they get approved, where it says implementation status instead of using the term not adopted, how about not implemented, to be more clear that the committee adopted the recommendation to the Bureau, but the Bureau chose not to implement the recommendation for whatever reason.
That sounds great. More clear, yeah. Mr. Sweeney?
This is both a very old industry and a new industry at the same time. And I certainly don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And this is going to be, to me, this is going to be ongoing. I suspect that we of course will adopt these recommendations, but I suspect that there are going to be a lot of changes that are going to be made in an ongoing way. I know by statute we are required to submit a report, and I especially want to thank the staff for and the committees and the drafters, because this is a very complex, detailed, meticulous work. That being said, I think we all understand we have a conscious duty in this evolving industry to continue to advocate and continue to make changes. And of course, we'll be working with our legislature, hopefully a little bit as well. So that's my long-winded way of saying let's move the recommendations.
I had one more, though, I think, if I can, please.
Sure.
I think another point of clarification, because what I heard clearly here, they didn't understand what we were trying to do here, which was memorialize what has happened, and then so that way the state can look at what recommendations this committee made based upon the decisions that have been made by the regulators, and then assess that based upon outcomes over the next year. So like you said, Mr. Sweeney, we could make an assessment on whether some of those earlier recommendations might be prudent in the future or a modification somewhere in the future. So I think if you add to adopted by or not adopted or by, you would be either CDFA, it'd be BCC, so you'd know what agency that particular subgroup would fall under, and that they didn't adopt it or they partially adopted it. That way it's clear who the adoption was, because any of the recommendations made here were recommendations that were made by this committee. And so I think that would be helpful. I think that kind of delineates what our role was versus the agencies looking at it. They obviously had reasons for or not adopting or partially adopting or totally adopting our recommendations, but I think that's how you delineate the differences between what our role was and the role of the regulators.
I'm just going to add, on behalf of our at-home viewers, we've been asked to speak very clearly into the microphone, so it picks up.
I'm sorry. I've been looking to the committee and the writers.
Okay, any further discussion before we move to the vote? Okay.
Baboyan.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Farrow.
Aye.
Heidelbach Terremoto.
Aye.
Harada.
Aye.
Leff.
Aye.
Nikita.
Aye.
Peck.
Aye.
Stevenson. Sweeney.
Aye.
Todd.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Woo.
Aye.
You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay. Great. Now, it wasn't part of the motion, so I want to clarify moving forward whether the two advisory committee members who will help work with staff on any technical amendments should be me and Matt, or should be Miss Yu and Miss Nevedal, or somebody else. Is there a motion on that? Can only be two under our public meeting rules. Yeah, two, yeah.
Yeah, it would need to be, unless you would like it to be done in a Bagley-Keene forum, a subcommittee of two can work together. Once you get beyond two committee members, you run into Bagley-Keene and serial meeting issues. So it really just depends what format you want to use to manage this report.
Miss you.
I would defer to you, Madam Vice Chair.
Okay.
If it may, I think I would recommend Miss Yu and Ms. Nevedal continue writing the report just because they're the ones that put it together. They have a lot more insight into it. And it might allow for the final version to not drift too far off from the original version.
Are you open to doing it, Ms. Yu? I mean, that sounds like a good
Yes.
plan to me. I'm also willing to do it, but if you're willing to carry it through, you're obviously very familiar with the report, and would do it, you know, I think it's correct.
I know Ms. Nevedal isn't here to give her thoughts, but I would be open to that.
Yes, Ms. Beck.
Could we select you as an alternate? Should Ms. Nevedal reject that?
I don't see why not. We get creative with the motion.
Here, I can clarify. So you've already appointed a subcommittee for the writing, Ms. Yu and Ms. Nevedal. So you could do motion, but you can also just allow them to continue their work.
Okay.
And then if for some reason one of them can't, the chair does have the ability, I believe, to appoint subcommittee members. So if one of them couldn't, the chair then could appoint a subcommittee member to that to take the place of whomever can't continue on that committee.
Okay, Ms. Peck?
Well, since we're here, if Mr. Babulian would put that in a motion, I'll second it.
Okay, or maybe, we might not need a motion, I can just.
Yeah, I think we should
in
let
my
them continue.
Right, you have that, because you already have the subcommittee established, they can move forward, and if for some reason one of the members of the subcommittee couldn't continue, the chair has the ability to appoint another subcommittee member, so it does not need to happen here
So
in a motion.
Okay, so I can say in my authority, I'll ask Ms. Yu and Ms. Nevedal to continue as the subcommittee writing to do the amendments till it's published, and then in the event that Ms. Nevedal doesn't want to, we can act absent a motion to substitute myself or somebody else. Is that good? Okay, great. Then let's move on to the third agenda, sub-agenda item of agenda item number 4, which is discussion and possible action on the committee process of, I'm sorry, wrong one, of the annual report global issues. And this is in your packet, and it's the two unnumbered, or the 4 unnumbered pages that are in between page number 27 and 28, and would presumably go in this part in the report, renumbered. So it's the overarching concerns, and I'd like to open up the discussion by asking Mr. Bulbian to talk about the work that he did on it.
So on the overarching concerns, I've worked on this with Dr. Cermak. Unfortunately, Dr. Cermak wasn't able to be here today, and he was traveling the past couple of days, so the final version of it, he wanted it to be noted that he didn't get an opportunity to touch on the final version, but it's close to 95-99% of what the version is that he did see it. Would you like me to go through and read it, or just touch on a couple of the points?
Why don't you give us the highlights of the issues you included, and then we can have further discussion.
Sure. So we identified reoccurring themes throughout the year on issues raised by the committee. The primary ones were equity issues, efforts to promote participation in the new industry by members of the community disproportionately impacted by enforcement of the war on drugs by most measures has been unsuccessful, primarily because social equity means different things for different parts of the state. Lack of funding for the social equity program, lack of guidance and support and general tools for equity qualified businesses to survive, let alone be successful. Now, the Bureau's efforts to remedy some of these shortcomings hasn't gone unnoticed. Senate Bill 1294 intends to address some of the aforementioned issues by allocating $10 million to fund and assist eligible local equity applicants. Small business issues was another one. Intention of Prop 64 to favor small business farmers over big money operations, at least initially, has not reached the success anticipated. The continued layering of additional regulations on top of existing ones are burdensome, unnecessarily high cost of entry, do not favor small businesses. Lack of clarity on compliance requirements makes compliance for smaller businesses near impossible. Micro business issues were raised several times, almost every time. The intended purpose of the micro business license initially was to favor the small businesses. Definition of micro business is insufficiently clear and detailed. The initial spirit of the micro business license was to provide an opportunity for the small cultivator to be vertically integrated and have an opportunity to control margin compression and have an opportunity to survive. Current nature of the micro business license does not do this and offers no added value to the small cultivator. Current status of the micro business license is simply a vertically integrated license, no different than acquiring 4 individually licenses in the dispensary, cultivation, manufacturing, or distribution. Excessive regulatory burden on small businesses. The dual nature of the licensing process is creating a bottleneck in licensing at the local municipal level. Majority of local municipalities are not issuing licenses or are slow in rolling out their cannabis programs. Of the municipalities issuing licenses, most are not issuing retail. Patchwork ordinances at a local level is creating patchwork system that's not always in line with state requirements and is lacking in uniformity on a statewide level. Banking is a big issue. Continued lack of access to normal business banking services remains unnecessary burden on businesses. Complicates tax collection and presents public safety issues. Though not strictly a state issue, federal banking issues have created public safety. Enforcement issues were constantly raised. Unlicensed underground market continues to flourish due in part to the competitive financial advantage such operations have over legal cannabis businesses, which are committed to paying licensing fees and collecting taxes. Lack of enforcement is creating a thriving environment for the unregulated market. Lack of enforcement is creating unfair competition for businesses that go through the gauntlet and receive their license by having to compete with businesses not licensed and not paying taxes. Enforcement is fragmented and uncoordinated. Compassionate use is one of the bigger issues constantly coming up. Importance of patient needs has been outweighed and replaced by business interests that are better able to navigate the generally complex regulatory process required to obtain licensure, as well as ongoing compliance requirements to ensure safe, tested, and compliant cannabis products. Not all businesses are seeking the profit, and a regulatory or licensing scheme is needed to address businesses serving compassionate use needs, particularly for patients unable to afford medical cannabis. Public education issues. Public education on safe cannabis use is severely lacking. The general public is not sufficiently helped to differentiate the difference between licensed and unlicensed businesses. Taxation issues. There does not appear to be an objective method for determining the contribution of current tax rates to maintaining the underground market. The cumulative tax burden is in excess of 35% and may not be sustainable. Excessive tax burdens can de-incentivize licensure. Regulatory fragmentation issues. The need for licensees to interact with three separate regulatory agencies, BCC, DPH, and CDFA, is burdensome. Increasing coherence by providing one single point of contact will be advantageous to business operators. And finally, there has been inefficient and ineffective use of Cannabis Advisory Committee due to the following challenges and concerns. Due to required Open Meeting Act rules, only items on the agenda could be discussed, and committee procedures to get issues on future agenda through the committee chair have not always resulted in accurately set agendas. While agendas were routinely posted 10 days before meetings, as required by law, some meeting material arrived shortly before meetings, and some committee members did not have adequate time to review the material. Many CAC members have never served on a public advisory committee subject to Bagley-Keene open meeting requirements and find those rules are limiting. Limitations with Bagley-Keene rules prevent committee members from making full use of the time it has available during the meeting, and on a fairly regular basis, committee members with experience serving on boards have requested rulings based on Robert's rules.
Okay, thank you. So I think our options for this portion of the report are the same as the previous portion, that we can adopt it as written, or we can adopt it in concept with then some follow-up amendments to be determined. But I'll open it now to discussion on the global issues portion of the report. Yes.
So,
Mr.
just Member Nikita, just again, compliments to the drafters. I think this does accurately capture a lot of the issues that we discussed, and so to me it's pretty comprehensive. The only thing that I would propose actually is to strike the final section on the inefficient and effective use of the Cannabis Advisory Committee, and I will explain why I'm proposing that. To me, these are limitations that are statutory. I mean, the law is creating these issues, and it's, complaining about these obvious challenges, which we did have, I don't think is going to move the legislature in any particular direction on these open meeting laws, which are, I know they're cherished and they're not going anywhere. I also believe that the chair is not here, and sometimes it's easier to compliment someone who's not here, but I do think the chair did a good job. We had, if you recall our earlier meetings, we had hundreds of people here. We went, well into the evening on some of our meetings, and we just had a challenge addressing all of the issues we set for ourselves in the first year. I would be open to a different process for setting agendas as well. But beyond that, I think having acknowledged these challenges, and I agree we have them, I'm not sure it's appropriate or fair to put them in this report.
Yeah, I had the same. I would just same concern. I mean, there's no one is more frustrated with the open meeting aspects of this than I am, as people who sit adjacent to me can attest. But I mean, what are we going to do about it? The law is the law. I think that's. I don't think it helps us to kind of complain about that. But I do think in general it's a really well written section of the report, and I agree with what's in there, by and large.
I think that it might be a good idea. I understand the concerns, but I also think that it's notable just in this, in the forum and in the process, what we've gone through, some of the frustrations that we have shared. I also think that this document is very well put together. I think when we started down this path of legalization, we all had really high hopes of how this was going to pan out, and we had high hopes for the small farmer and people being able to continue in these small areas up north, being able to, some of the concerns that we're looking at, taxation, the barriers to entry, people not being able to get a license. So I think that it's well-rounded, and because of that, I think we should leave the concerns regarding the meeting in there.
Well, as a person who sits on another board, I can assure you that on those boards, we also have the same frustrations with the Meeting Act, right? And unless we want to be sued because we're doing things, in not being transparent with the public, we have to live under these rules. So as much as I agree with you that it is accurate to what we've shared, the frustrations that we all shared, that it doesn't move the ball forward. I think, sort of like Mr. Sweeney said earlier, we don't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. The last thing I want it to look like is that this committee, who has struggled with those and still delivered on a lot of good recommendations, that we're resentful for the having to follow the rules. So I would recommend that we take it out and focus on those issues that we think still need to be remedied. We can't remedy the Meeting Act, but we can remedy some of the other challenges. And I think, having met with all of you and the folks from BCC and all the staff that have been assigned here, they're committed to making these things work too. And so that's why I would say remove the portion that's something beyond our control. Focus our energy on the items that we do know that need to be remedied, whether that's equity and how that equity is defined between which group. I think fantastic to point out the rural difference. I mean, there's an equity dealing with legacy. I know that you said it wasn't in there, but we do know legacy is an important part. You captured everything very well. The challenges, the frustrations, and the opportunities. So with that would be my recommendation.
Further discussion?
I just want to jump in and just say, I agree with kind of taking out that last point, given that it is a more of a statutory issue, but then that kind of comes back to, this overarching area. I found it interesting on the front page, kind of third paragraph, you kind of bold the overarching reality, 1 year after legalization, kind of that statement. If I was going to emphasize something, though, I would have emphasized kind of earlier up, right, because the following concerns cannot be remedied by regulatory agencies. Right, that's what I would emphasize, because I think for this whole year, most of the discussion, most of the contentious issues have been focused on things that I didn't think that we could change. And this is going to be read by people who have the ability to, legislatively change things. So that's what I would emphasize. So I just want to point that out.
Okay, further discussion or motion?
To make a couple of comments on the final section of it. The general purpose of the overarching concern section was to touch on stuff that wasn't going to be covered in the general report that we put out there. And even in the general report, there are a lot of stuff that's statutory in nature that's not really going to change much. And part of the reason why the topic of adding this section of the report even came up was later on next year, there are going to be a lot of opportunities for legislative change, and it's really to be able to touch on that, to bring awareness to it. I mean, look, even for nothing else, it got the conversation started between us. When we look at the beginning of the year when we started this, a lot of the meetings were very quiet, not a lot of input. And one of the things is to really just encourage just healthy debate. There's nothing wrong with it. We've got 22 people on this advisory board representing different stakeholders in the industry, from municipalities to law enforcement to industry to labor. So this is really more on bringing awareness to the issues that do exist. one of the reasons why we did put in the Bagley-Keene and the Roberts Rule comments that kept coming up is there an opportunity to possibly change it to Roberts Rules, and not necessarily, it doesn't have anything to do with the open meeting rules, but is there another set of rules that we can follow that might make for a better opportunity to have that healthy debate? I do agree with the mention of the chair, all compliments to the chair throughout the year for his efforts and his work, and it wasn't to call out the chair, it was really more to highlight who the agenda items go through and who actually has the final authority on setting the agenda. So I wouldn't have an issue with taking out the chair portion of it, but generally on the report, and I know this is something that Dr. Cermak also feels pretty strongly about. So I do like Mr. Yu's comment about maybe moving it up to the front of the area where it's kind of set up to the rest of the report, at least this section of it. So those are the general comments I would have on the section.
Let me just make a point of clarification for you in terms of Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act and Roberts Rules and how they interplay. Essentially, they serve two purposes. Bagley-Keene is about public participation and transparency. Roberts Rules are more procedural rules for, how you make the motions, how you set up the motions. So they're not necessarily interchangeable. And I think sometimes there's a little confusion that you use one or the other when effectively they're different purposes. Bagley-Keene really talks about, posting the agenda and allowing public comment and how things must proceed from that perspective, whereas Robert's Rules is strictly meeting procedure.
Okay, further discussion or motion?
Make a motion. I move to approve the CAC annual report overarching concerns section with two changes, highlighting the language that starts on the first page, because the following concerns often cannot be remedied by regulatory agencies without legislative action, all the way to the end of the sentence, maybe in bold, and by striking the final section, finally, all the way through the end of Robert's Rules.
And can I just clarify, is that to adopt, with then still the ability to make technical amendments?
Yes.
Technical edits before it's published?
Yes, technical edits that don't affect
or
the
not
substance.
substantive enough. Okay. Then we have a second.
Can I actually ask you to clarify one piece of the motion real quickly? I think in your discussion, you had mentioned bolding the because maybe instead of the sentence that follows it's bolded. So is your motion to have them both bolded or to remove the bold on that sentence that follows?
I would just have them both bold.
Okay, that's fine. We just want to clarify before the vote that people understand what will be bolded. Thank you.
Point of clarification, as a drafter who would merge this document in, and just to keep the same tone, but still keeping obviously the main concept, would be amenable to amend the motion so we adopt this as the main concept instead of the exact way it's written here.
Yes, I believe we did clarify that the motion would allow for technical edits that don't affect the substance of the.
Great, thank you. It includes that.
And I was asked to clarify by Ms. Peck, yes, my motion would strike the section at the end that starts with finally there has been inefficient all the way through the end of the section that ends with Robert's Rules.
Mr. Hickey, so just to comment, so on the first page, it's to bold it. On the last page is to take out finally and everything after, right?
Right.
Actually, I would even second that.
Right. Okay, public comment on the motion.
Hi, Paul Hansberry. This does touch on many of the things, and thank you very much. Actually, both documents have been very well put together. I have objections to the interpretation, so that when things are called statutory, they're actually the interpretations of the Bureau, rather than being statutory, because of their interpretation of the statute. I believe that the statute is open to different interpretations. And the subcommittee has given recommendations that have been dismissed as statutory, when it's just a different interpretation of the statute, which could be absorbed. Especially when it comes to the micro business. I mean, there are interpretations that the Bureau has taken for micro business. For instance, where it says "and," they say now you can pick 3 of the 4. They call it a micro business when it's unlimited manufacturing, distribution, and retail. There's nothing micro about that. That's their interpretation, and that's what they say. So when it's returned, the recommendations are returned as statutory from this committee. It's their interpretation of the statute. Speaking to how many people used to be here, I've been to every one of these meetings, and they did go way over. In fact, microbusiness was deleted in one of them where I traveled to San Diego for. The reason they're not here, and we were up in Humboldt County discussing microbusiness, and there was more members on the committee than there was in the audience. They've given up. They're not accepting what is the purpose of the advisory committee if the Bureau and the agencies aren't taking the recommendations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Speaker 2, please. Or speaker
First
3.
and foremost, I want to say peace and thank you guys for coming to Fresno. I'm a resident here. My children were born here in the city. And one of the issues that I want to bring into attention is some of the barriers that we see is we have companies that come into our city, big companies, and disguise themselves as equitable enterprises. And a lot of small local people that are trying to get into the industry, what happens in Oakland, and similar to their equity plan, I just want to make sure that that doesn't happen here locally. And I would just like to have a better understanding of how community can have input within these subcommittees to add language. I don't know if that's something that is open to public or is just between you guys. I would like to have better clarity on how that relationship can be fortified and built at a more local level. So I guess that's a question.
Yes, if you have a question for the committee members, please form it in a comment. They're not allowed to answer your questions at this time.
Thank you. Last thing, from the People's Dispensary in Fresno.
Thank you. Can I go Speaker 1, please?
I think this man is next.
Go ahead.
Hi, Ross Gordon, California Growers Association. Just want to thank you all and Mr. Boboyan, especially for putting together this report. I think it definitely reflects our concerns and our sense of where things are in an overarching sense in the industry. Definitely caused me to reflect a little bit on how quickly things have changed. I think 10 months ago, most people were either excited or apprehensive or scared because we were going to legalize cannabis here and nobody really knew what was going to happen, but it was something to be excited about. I feel like now there's much more agreement that these issues of equity in terms of how the market is distributed in both urban and rural areas, and these issues of, is there going to be a regulated market at all? Like, are people going to buy regulated product, or are they going to stay doing what they've always done? That these are really the core issues that we need to address and the entire country needs to address as they move towards regulatory systems that work. So I really appreciate this. I think this is very important for regulators to see, for legislators especially to see, because they are not down here in the day-to-day. And I'm excited in 2019 to start working towards these goals. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's move to Speaker 1, please.
Susan Tibbin. This overarching concerns report is brilliant. It's beautifully written. It's compassionately written. Thank you very, very much. But I am absolutely convinced that it must be opposite day. Because it says here, ensuring a regulated environment for commercial cannabis activity that does not impose such barriers as to perpetrate rather than reduce or eliminate the illicit market for cannabis. The illicit market for cannabis is robust. No one is happy about it, but because the state seems to have used their interpretation, their unique interpretation, and then deemed that regulation, this is what we get. The very lowest entry is looking at over $100,000, which, if that farmer continues to do what she has been doing, she will be approximately $34,000 in debt after the first year. That's with the price of cannabis remaining what it is today, which it won't. It will continue to drop. She'll then have the privilege of paying that $100,000 the next year, no matter how compliant she is. In terms of actual medicine, you have absolutely elucidated compassionate use and the problem. We are now worse than Colorado. There is virtually no ratio-specific actual medicine for palliative care, shrinking tumors, controlling seizures, etc. People are calling up and down the state for that. So, the word on the street has been for a long time that when Sean Parker took control of cannabis, neither the state nor Sean Parker wanted small farmers because it's easier to collect big bucks from big industry. We would like to give you our small dollars, if you'll let us.
Your time is up.
Thank
you. Thank you. For the sake of order, let's move with Speaker 2, please.
Tim Moreland, River Distributing. Want to thank this advisory committee for all the hard work you've done, all the regulators who are sitting there. Thanks for the summary for kind of the overarching issues that are happening in the cannabis industry. As the compliance director for a large distributor, enforcement issues are huge for us. Our retail market is getting wiped out in this state by black market competition. It is literally getting wiped out via taxes, via folks who have no desire to be in the regulated market are just completely overrunning these retailers whom we sell products to. And then on the supply side, it is very hard for folks to become licensed, and they're running into troubles with their local governments and getting licensed. And we somehow need to fix this. We need to be able to be inclusive of these folks. We need to have more retail access so we can sell these products and therefore produce the tax revenue and fund all these programs by Prop 64. This is very important. So we ask for your continued support of this and continue pushing for these measures. Taxes are really, and it's not so much state taxes, really the local taxes are really kind of hurting. I got a notice in the mail from a city that I will not name saying that as a distributor that I have to pay their local cannabis gross receipts tax, which is 8%. That means I have to, you add the taxes, the 15% tax with the markup, with the 8% that they want to charge a distributor going in, and then the 8% that they're going to charge the ultimate consumer of the product. That tax rate is getting into 50%. There is absolutely no way that a licensed shop can compete with someone who wants to do this illegally. There is no way, and we've got to do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 3.
Good morning, committee members. Jonathan Munoz on behalf of the California Police Use Association. I also want to thank you. I'm a native from the Central Valley, so it's good to come home in Fresno. On this last issue that
Can you speak up? I'm sorry. Can you speak up, please?
On these last issues that we've been talking about, many of our members have also had concerns with the enforcement side of it. Is how do we go after those bad actors? How do we determine who then we report to? Is it the BCC? Is it the Food and Ag Department? Or is it the Department of Consumer Affairs? These are all overarching issues that we expressed concern with when it was in the legislature, when it came to the voters. And we would just like to see some clarity so that we can further boost the regulated market so that we can help further the intent of Prop 64 was to, stymie the black market, the illicit cannabis market, in a way that is beneficial not only for business but also for communities, that we can guarantee a certain level of safety and also see revenues come in and hopefully stop relying on the black market. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan Munoz on behalf of the California Police Use Association.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask Tamara to restate the motion before we move to a vote, just because it had a number of different parts.
Okay, Mr. Nikita, let me know if I get this incorrect, but I think the motion was to adopt in concept the overarching report and to highlight in the second paragraph the last sentence that begins as because all the way through the end of that sentence, and to strike from the end everything after the word finally, that last paragraph with the 4 bullet points, and to allow for edits that do not change the substance of the report.
Okay, then we will move to a vote.
Boboian.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Farrow.
Aye.
Heidelbach Terremoto.
Abstain.
Harada.
Aye.
Leff.
Aye.
Nikita.
Aye.
Peck.
Aye.
Stevenson.
Aye.
Sweeney.
Aye.
Todd.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Wu.
Aye.
You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
So I would, if Ms. Yu and Mr. Bulbian are amenable, I would like to transfer the responsibility for finalizing this part of the report to Ms. Nevedal and Ms. Yu so that they can put it together in a way that reads as one coherent report instead of having two separate teams working on pages, if you two are agreeable to doing that. Okay, so I will do that. So you and Ms. Nevedal, but if I'll substitute in someone else if Ms. Nevedal is not amenable, we'll have the responsibility with the agency of finalizing the report and making sure the two pieces work together and read together. Is that okay?
Great, thank you.
Okay. Let's see. We are now going to break for lunch for 45 minutes, which brings us back here at 12:35. Okay, adjourned. We're now on agenda item number 5, which is discussion and possible action on the committee process of creating meeting agendas. And I want to orient everyone to 2 items that were emailed and that are in the packet. One is a list of the Cannabis Advisory Committee future agenda items. So these are a compiled list of all the various agenda items that were raised by committee members over the course of the year of our meetings, and the meeting date where they were raised. And then the second item we have is the handbook, which the committee adopted, I believe at our second meeting in January, that sets forth the process for creating agendas, which is that it's on page, let me see for a second. It's on page 6, and it's one of the responsibilities of the chair. Says one of the responsibilities is to develop agendas for the meetings with the Bureau. The second thing I'll just note is that we don't actually have any future meetings scheduled at this point, but that, and this is our last meeting for the end of this year. And so my understanding of the process is that in the beginning of the new year, the Bureau will reach out to establish a schedule for meetings for the new year, when we will reconvene. And one other thing, one part of that, I believe at our next meeting will be a re-election of the chair and the vice chair, which is also in the handbook that we adopted, is something that happens annually. And we've now been meeting for a year, I think, and we did that at our January meeting at the very beginning of this year. So I will now open it to any discussion or action on this agenda item.
So can I ask, this is the issue we're discussing now is not what our future agendas will be like, but what the process for creating the agendas will be, correct?
That's correct. So we actually do have what we have on our agenda every time, the item number 7, which is future agenda items. And actually this document that the Bureau compiled for us is all the things that we've mentioned during that agenda item at the previous agendas. And we'll do that again today to put on future agenda items. This item is just to discuss, have a time, if we want, to discuss the process we've had thus far of creating the meeting agendas. Yeah. And I'll just give let me just give a little context as to why this appeared on the agenda, and that was out of, some conversation that happened, particularly I think at our last meeting and maybe the one prior, which I actually wasn't even in attendance at, about, questions and concerns about what items were appearing on the agendas, how they were appearing on the agendas, and what things weren't on the agendas, and some concern about people who had items and they weren't appearing on the agenda. I think also particularly we've actually had a very busy year because there was the temporary rulemaking process and then the rulemaking process, and we had the subcommittees and a bulk of work we had to do this year. In my mind, next year might look quite different in terms of how we focus our time and speakers that we bring in. So I think there's also that to consider. But the purpose of putting it on was to create a space in the meeting structure when we can actually talk with each other, since one of the frustrations is that we can't talk when we're not all sitting here, to at least create a space that we can have or not. Because it'll also, I think, come up at our first meeting next time when we talk about re-election of the chair and the vice chair, maybe what we want that role to be. We can talk about it then too. But just to have a place on the agenda where we could have that conversation because people were wanting to talk about it and not able to because of the public meeting requirements. So that's how it got on here. And we can discuss it now or not. But you have a...
So just a few things. I noticed on here, and this was a point that I brought up just a few meetings ago, that if we could match legislatively what's happening with the work we're trying to complete, I think that would help us. And I noticed here that at some point, Chair Ron had brought that up as well, and I think that would be helpful to discuss at a future meeting. And then one thing that I do want to touch on, and I of course come from the Teamsters, and so I'm concerned about workers. Currently, I think there is, we obviously have this LPA requirement that is in the regulations, but what's happening is workers are feeling intimidated to sit down and discuss some of the issues that they have because of things like video cameras that show at their workplace who they're talking to. And because we have a large workforce that is coming out, that's just something that we're lacking on this table that maybe at a future date we can discuss, because there are multiple people in different sectors of this industry that approach us and say, I've got some huge concerns. And then the minute someone finds out that they are trying to engage with a labor union, they are intimidated. That, I think, is a concern.
Okay, thanks. One thing I will say that I think reflects sort of how I have seen the agenda items, some of the concerns I've heard is that there's lots of people who are on the committee who are representing a specific constituency that's smaller in the whole picture, but important as to why they're here. So one thing for us to think about in setting the agendas next year is perhaps how do we create space sort of for those minority voices or issues to have a space in the committee. Hopefully next year we'll have more space for that, given that there'll be changes to the rules, but the bulk of them will be adopted. But I hear that concern, and I think it's one that's reflected with some other committee members as well.
And I just think that, this is, we've been doing this a year, and, we've got a lot of kinks that we're working out, and, there's a lot of business owners that are trying to figure out, and some folks that unfortunately it's sad to see aren't going to be here in a while. And so I think we've all kind of been patient and just kind of waited to see how this is all going to pan out. But if we're talking about next year and next year topics, hopefully we're going to be moving past some of the regulatory issues that we're having and moving into people working in that workspace. Yeah. So that would be a great idea.
And assessing some of the impact of the... Others comment? Yes.
This may be a crazy notion, but I think that in all the other, boards and commissions and stuff that I've been not served on, but I've been involved in, particularly as counsel, every member of the committee or board or commission has the opportunity to place an item on the agenda. Now that individual places the item, leads the discussion, and then it's voted on by the remaining members, or by all the members, with some discretion by the chair on the organization of the agenda itself. And the chair does retain the ability to decline to place something on the agenda, although I haven't known that to be exercised often. We might consider a similar process here, understanding that the person who places something on the agenda really needs to have, there needs to be an end there. It can't just be talk about everything under the sun on a particular item. Or if there's a lot of us, so that's a consideration, we can break it out when we have a meeting schedule. Give certain individuals an opportunity to place items on their designated agendas, something of that nature.
Right, to control the overall length. I think one
Right.
concern would be the length of the meeting.
Right.
So pacing it throughout the year.
Right, well, I mean, some boards, they get through 56 items in 5 hours. It just depends what they're dealing with and how they're dealing with it.
Yeah.
But, if we're concerned about too many items in each meeting, maybe we give everyone an opportunity at a meeting throughout the next year to place something on that they would like to discuss. That way, all of us here, because if you look at our list, we've all said stuff that we weren't able to take up. At least there's an outlet for getting that discussion on the table.
Right, okay. One other thing I would note that I think might enhance we might think about for future meetings when we suggest agenda items is sometimes there's a suggestion of the topic, but then that doesn't mean that the regulators or the creation of the agenda knows who the right speaker would be or how to contact them or get them to the meeting. So we could also think about trying to be specific. I don't know about cultivating that information outside the meeting when, if someone suggested a topic and then you want to have follow-up as to who or how is something for us to consider. Others?
I had a comment on that.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues because of the Bagley Keene, but because of the Bagley Keene stuff, at the end of every meeting we talk about future agenda items, but then we never really set the agenda. And after the meeting, the powers that be discuss it and then put together the language for the agenda item, which as a committee we see it just almost immediately before the actual meeting, and then we're limited to the wording of that day's agenda. Maybe a solution would be at the end of a meeting when we talk about future agenda items, actually agendize the future meeting in committee at the end of the day. This way, all of us, we have basically 2 months to put together whatever discussion it is that we want to have. But then there's a general understanding of what that future agenda item would be instead of having it be a surprise a couple days before the actual meeting takes place. And the other problem is when we talk about some of the stuff and we leave it open-ended without agendizing it, then whatever the language ends up being on the actual agenda, that's what becomes our limitation on it. So maybe a solution is at the end of the meeting, start talking about what the future agenda item is and what the discussion topic is. Even if the agenda actually gets agendized after the meeting, we at least know what the intent of that agenda item would be for the future.
So,
Go ahead, and then Ms. Peck.
It must be opposite day, because I was going to raise the exact opposite concern, which is I thought we were proceeding where we pretty much were setting the next meeting's agenda at the open meeting, at the current meeting, and restricting ourselves to that. And my question was going to be, is that a strict requirement of Bagley Keene? Because I know that's not how we operate on other advisory committees that I have sat on. And, I feel like that's rather a cumbersome. I feel like there's things that can arise in the interim, and there really ought to be an ability to get things on the agenda a little more nimbly than that. So I don't know what the right answer is, but that's the concern I was going to express.
I can help you a little bit with that from a legal perspective. So the future agenda items is something most of the boards at DCA do because it gives everybody the opportunity to express to the chair items they'd like to see on the agenda. Because outside the meeting, the problem is the chair can't be talking to multiple people to figure out what agenda items might be there. So that's an opportunity to say, hey, these are things we want to see, and then as it gets closer and you're looking at time frames and who you can get to come on different topics, the chair typically finalizes it kind of as an administrative piece of their duties, because the problem can become, you might want to all talk about this, that, or the other, but let's say after the meeting and you vote and that's what it's going to be, but then when staff reaches out or the chair reaches out, whatever speaker can't come, then you have a hole, and what do you do with your agenda? So it's kind of, I think, an approach that allows for that communication, but then allows it to be a little more nimble. And you can certainly send information into staff as well.
So if I read you right, the practice of doing it the way we're doing it now is more of a kind of a best practice, like a courtesy to the members to do it, discuss it, rather than a strict requirement.
Yes.
Okay. And that makes, yeah.
Ms. Peck?
Yes, I'm still confused because we do say what we would like to see on the agenda, and I think as the our regulatory body has put forth the form today, that these topics don't come to fruition. So if it says in our handbook that the CAC will use Robert's Rules of Order to the extent that it does not conflict with state law, then I think that we should view Robert's Rules of Order in setting forth an agenda. And I think that should be what we follow. Because I don't know that Bagley-Keene addresses the agenda, whereas Robert's Rules does. So, and it says that we're using both. So if council wants to do clarification, then I'd like to hear.
I think your handbook kind of points to Robert's Rules as a guide to be used, but it's not required like Bagley-Keene. And your handbook does talk about how the chair will develop the agenda. So the future agenda items, the way it's agendized is those are topics the committee wants to see on an agenda, but not necessarily topics that will be at the very next meeting, because usually what would happen is you take all those topics, like I mentioned, and see what the time frame looks like in terms of the number of topics and who is or isn't available, and if there's any deadlines. Like I think today the agenda was primarily on the annual report because you've got that looming deadline, just like earlier in the year most of the meeting time was spent on regulation recommendations and then working those other topics around that. So the way the future agenda items has been working, and it's a typical way for the boards and bureaus of DCA, is that it gives the opportunity for people to say these are topics we want, but yet the chair or the vice chair, depending on usually the chair, but if they're not available, the vice chair can take some of those duties to figure out from a temporal perspective and an availability perspective what's on the next agenda versus what's on something later in the year.
I totally understand, but we're still back to the discussion that agenda items are not moving forward, and as you can see on the sheet that's before us. So I guess the question is, how do we address that? How do we, as an advisory board, bring forth agenda items that we've been trying to bring forth? And I think that if it's on the agenda today, I think that discussion needs to happen.
Can I just ask a clarification that the way we currently do agendas is controlled by our handbook, but is our handbook a reflection of like Bagley-Keene requirements or not? Like what are our constraints there?
Right. It is a function of your handbook. Your handbook cannot be in conflict with Bagley-Keene. So you have to be careful about that. So for example, your agenda has a legal obligation to be up at least 10 days before your meeting, irrespective of what internal process you want for setting the agenda.
That's procedural due process, pretty much. I mean, you're spelling that out in a set of procedures. Okay, you have to have 10-day notice. That's part for the public as well as for us to know what's going on. But I think I have to agree. There are things that I thought were going to be on an agenda, and the agenda comes out and it's not on. So you don't have a way of kind of knowing whether what you articulated gets passed on or something else becomes more of a priority. And I do agree that, for instance, when we started talking about the issue of equity and to defining what equity actually meant, we never really got down to that in terms of precision. We weren't able, for instance, we weren't able to say, well, does equity in this instance, is it inclusive of legacy farmers, or is it not? Is it for women and ethnic minorities? Are there other categories? So when we started talking about this as being a viable topic, even as there was legislation that was referenced here, AB 1294, that became an issue. So there is some ambiguity in terms of how things get on the agenda. We talked about that there were special concerns that Native Americans had, and that this was an issue that was going to be put on the agenda. It never got on the agenda. And, you know, people say, well, we'll fold that into the discussion. Now, I understand that we are juggling a plethora of issues here. And so all of this may not be as transparent as we would like it to be, but at least if we are clear with how we put something on the agenda, then nobody can say that they didn't exercise using what that mechanism was, whether it gets on the agenda or not.
Mr. Guerra?
So let me see if I can try to clarify this, I think, and maybe council can give me an idea. Generally speaking, at the end of these meetings, under the future agenda items, we all say things we'd like to see at some time in the future. And we leave the total discretion to the chair. However, if it was made more formally in the form of a motion, I'd like to make a motion that at the next meeting, we take up item agenda X, and you get a second, and there's a vote for that. That would have to be included with whatever the chair is left the discretion to put on. Is that correct?
Typically, that would be true,
Right.
yes.
So
it
what
would
I would-
help, just so you know, that from a legal perspective, though, if, for example, you want to put that on, but then staff were to go, say, and reach out to a speaker who's not available, it makes it a little tougher
Sure.
because you've got it, required it to be on that agenda. But yes, a motion, the committee could certainly make a motion as to how they want to handle future agenda items.
And the motion, presumably the motion could be framed if the speaker is available or
Right,
something,
right,
to allow some discretion.
Sure, but other than that. And the other thing I think we should all be cognizant of, we have standard ongoing items that have to be on every time, so there should be like an old business, new business kind of thing. It's old business, even though it's not that, it's every time we're going to review the minutes, hopefully from the last meeting, provided there's not some issue with the minutes being prepared or something, and we're always going to have a public comment, and then there's some ambiguity in between. So if there's a regulatory piece that's moving and it's going to be, before us that we need to handle, that's going to be on there, it's going to be required, but there's going to be some time, and I would suggest that as we make recommendations in the future for future agenda items, that people who are really interested in making sure something's on, that they do it in the form of a motion so we can take action and ensure we send a clear message to the chair where we'd like to go if possible.
Yeah, the only thing I would say about making a motion is it would just end up dragging it on a little bit longer each time, because if we're putting out 4 or 5 agenda items and we're going to end up coming up with 4 or 5 different motions for those future agenda items every time going out to public comment, generally when we get to the last item, which is future agenda items, it doesn't really take us more than 5-10 minutes of conversation to figure out what we want to discuss next time. But I think the general misunderstanding, at least on my end, would be when we were having these discussions, my understanding was that it was going to be on the next agenda item, not necessarily sometime in the future at the discretion of the chair. So if we're able to have a 5-10 minute conversation at the end of every meeting on what we want to discuss at the next meeting, it's just as simple as coming to a consensus. Hey, this is the next agenda. This is what it's going to include. These are the line items that we're going to discuss. Because if we talk about the speaker situation, I understand that leaves a gap in there. I think we're pretty good about filling in those gaps, but we've only really had 3 speakers throughout this entire year, so to limit it based on the speaker availability, that's something that we can just work with on the fly. But I think it's as simple as coming up with a consensus at the end of every meeting. These are the 3 items we want to discuss. These are the 4 items. And if there's something that comes out, like the emergency final first draft of the regulations come out, the chair uses his discretion to put it on the agenda item so we don't show up at a meeting where the emergency rules just came out or whatever legislative document came out, and then now we're agendizing it for the next one, which is 2 months later, which is completely after the fact, and it becomes irrelevant by the time we even get to talk about it.
I think we're all saying the same thing. In other words, I think we ought to be able to agree at the end of a meeting that there's certain things that the consensus of the group is we expect to see this or that on the next agenda. And then we want the ability to add things, for the chair to be able to add things, as they arise in the interim that are of urgent nature or timely nature, right? Okay.
Can I ask Tamara,
Yeah.
if on the final agenda item 7, if someone wants to make a specific motion about something that would be on the next agenda, we're able to do that under that agenda item?
Ideally, ideally under the future agenda items, if you were going to do that, it would become on your agenda an action item where you talk, like you'll see some of these that are possible action. Typically, you would list that on the agenda if you were going to do more than just suggest future agenda items and actually take some sort of action about those items.
So is that something that can happen today under either this agenda item or number 7, or we'd have to, the next future agenda would have to change what that last item is?
Yeah, ideally, we would have, possible action on future agenda items, not just future agenda items. So that it's clear to the public that action may be taken on that item.
Okay. Other comments? Yes.
And just one last, last clarification. If, under Bagley-Keene, in preparing an agenda, if the committee, the committee members work through staff, we don't have the same limitations that we do. For example, if we submitted proposed agenda items to staff and they submitted it to the chair in one big list for the chair to go through, are there issues with that?
It depends how it's handled. So you can provide information to staff, but at the same time, if we're essentially carrying messages from the whole committee, then you have to be conscious of that.
You would be carrying a message from one committee member to the chair. In other words, you rather than me reach out to the chair directly, every person who wants something on the agenda reaches out to staff, and staff compiles them and then sits down with the chair to walk through them.
You can provide information to staff, but there are some limitations as to how much we can convey in terms of combining for the chair information from all the different committee members, because then you've got several members that are involved in the conversation. So it kind of just depends on how it happens.
Is it an issue the way I described it? Each committee member submits, I want to talk about this public health item. I submit it to staff. Everyone does the same thing. Staff compiles it and goes through it with the chair. Is that an issue?
If you're just sending administrative information into the staff, they can look at that information, but they can't really cumulatively say, here's different issues, it's different people, so many people want this on the agenda, because then it's really a discussion that with the chair about with more than one committee member. So it is a little more difficult. So really the best way to handle it is under these future agenda items, and that's why we put them on there, is so that the committee members can express what they want, and we don't have to run afoul of the serial meetings.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, let me give an example. Okay, so next time we are talking about that we may have to elect or re-elect, make a selection of a chair and a vice chair. Well, that's obviously an agenda item. You would obviously have to, procedural due process, you'd have to give the 10-day notice that would be required. Well, there's not a big generalized vote on that, but it's kind of essential to the process. So I would think that would be on the next agenda. Would that be correct?
The election of your officers, yes. Because the term of the officers right now is 1 year. They were elected in January of last year, so at the next meeting, as we're coming, the next meeting next year will be when you would elect your officers.
And so, but by looking at this process, it's not inconsistent with Bagley-Keene, and it's not inconsistent with Robert's Rules of Order, right? But yet there's no there's no generalized vote or anything. You know, in terms of the process that was just suggested, the process that was just suggested was that maybe we need to vote on items so that it eliminates why something may or may not get put on the agenda.
Right, you can, legally you can do that.
But I guess we'd want also the ability for the Bureau or the chair to add additional items such as like a procedural vote.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask one question. If we were to sort of do something, I think that's very sort of simple, if we made a motion that on our next agenda, rather than having an agenda item that says future agenda items, but said future agenda items and possible action on creating an agenda, would allow us at the next meeting, if we had a specific topic or two that we wanted to ensure at the subsequent meeting was heard, we could take action then on it.
Absolutely.
Then I'd like to make a motion that at our next, I'll say our next meeting since I don't know when it's scheduled, at our next meeting, the item that we typically have that's future agenda items be changed to future agenda items and possible action on creating agenda.
I'll second that.
I guess discussion on the motion. Okay, public comment?
Okay.
Go ahead, Speaker.
Hi, Paul Hansberry. That was sort of a stew of exactly what I was going to bring to the table here. I'm not sure how the democratic process factors into Bagley-Keene, but what if you took item 7, future agenda items, and put it earlier in the program, earlier on the agenda, where that 5 minutes is typically spent? And there's been a number of things from tribal lands, there's a number of things that have been brought up at every meeting and has never surfaced on the agenda. But if you took that 5 minutes that you normally take at the end of the day when everyone's tired, and you had the suggestion for agenda items, and then over the lunch break, you would accumulate those and then prioritize them and then bring them up for possible action and decide what the agenda is going to be. 10 days is the minimum that you have to have for notice. You can have 2 months' notice for what the agenda is going to be. So then people have the time to prepare for what the agenda item is going to be, and you can see the things that are coming up. So that then the committee members as a whole would be able to vote on what it is at the discretion of the chair. But they would be able to vote on a whole and know what they're preparing for the next meeting. So you would suggest the agenda items and then vote on them at the end of the meeting, item number 7, before the adjournment. So it's clear what you're walking into at the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. There's no other public comment at this time.
Boboyan.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Barrow.
Aye.
Heidelback Terremoto. Aye. Harada.
Aye.
Leff.
Aye.
Nikita.
Aye.
Heck.
Aye.
Stevenson.
Aye.
Sweeney. Todd.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Wu. Motion passes.
Okay, we'll now move on to agenda item number 6, which is public comment on items not on the agenda.
Go ahead, speaker number 1.
Okay, I'm Joseph Evans from Solana Lab Solutions. I have been a laboratory director at 2 labs in Colorado, started both those labs. I'm starting a lab here in California. I wanted to comment on variability because the variability issue, which was brought up, the first thing I'd like to say is that 10% variability will not be met. It's not met in the drinking water contaminants that you have on your table right there. And it's not going to be met by the QC requirements that are put into section 5730 in the regs, and I currently submitted a comment on this. But I would like to say something in respect to variability. It's good that it's in there, It needs to be in there. If the public is going to trust what's being sold, they're going to have to know that they are getting what's on the label. That is the way that you're going to be able to ensure enforcement, ensure that the black market will not be there. People do not buy their alcohol from bootleggers. They do not buy their prescription drugs from the black market. Why? Because they can trust what's on the label. That's going to need to be there. However, what I think needs to be done, and my recommendation here, is that if you recommend something like what we did in Colorado, and I started this, except it's hard to start from my perspective, is have a cannabis laboratory coalition put together with all the labs in the state and have that facilitated by the BCC, because the labs will then be able to come together, put together the right methodologies, ensure the variability is within a reasonable expectation. And again, that variability and that trust from the public is what's going to ensure that the black market will not exist.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Good afternoon, Susan Tibbin. Member Sweeney's comment regarding continuing changes and refinement of regulations is really much appreciated. However, non-cannabis businesses in Garberville, for instance, have now laid off 30% of their workforce. Non-cannabis businesses throughout the northern counties are seeing similar patterns. In less than 60 days, some Northern California counties are sunsetting licenses until 2020 or later in an effort to protect their legacy farmers. But a county license doesn't help the small operator if there is no state license. And yet the state continues to turn a blind eye to the growing financial disaster. The conversation last week in the county was, well, is this really a disaster? The fires were a disaster, but this is not a disaster. We assure you, this is a growing financial and subsequently social disaster in the northern counties. Without a cottage-level micro-business available statewide, the county's hands are tied. And so as much as we appreciate your hard work, and it is certainly evident, this document that you generated is proof. But without your help in moving the state to incorporate your suggestions and to incorporate the suggestions of us, legacy farmers, who you will notice are not here today. They were not in Eureka at the last meeting. They are trying to make ends meet in whatever way they can. And so if there's any way that we can prioritize and agendize cottage-level microbusiness as soon as possible, presumably in January, we would appreciate it. Thank you.
Speaker 3.
Hi, Paul Hansberry. What the speaker number 1 was talking about the standardization, I think is critical. The fluctuation in the testing is just, it's killing a number of people. The cottage, the small farmer, the cottage microbusiness, and getting a microbusiness as to what the intent of the statute was, instead of the interpretation that's been put onto it, is essential that be brought up. I think that if we were to look at the interpretation and try to break down some of the barriers instead of creating more, safety, of course, is paramount. But you have to understand that the cannabis industry has been thriving in California since 1996. These regulations were supposed to be for an existing industry, not create a new industry. And I've said it before, and the analogy is that the regulations are as if you're trying to regulate nuclear material or plutonium. These regulations are so onerous, and the taxation is so high that it's preventing people. The black market will not go away. In fact, it's encouraging the black market. You've heard that too many times. What speaker number 2 was talking about, and the demise of communities, businesses going out, jobs people being laid off to skeleton crews, taking out bank loans just to meet payroll and pay their income taxes. These communities are dying, and it's going to be a death by 1,000 cuts. The people that are out of jobs, the people that don't want to take the risk to operate in the black market, they don't have a work history. There's no training for them. Even if the jobs were there, they couldn't get them. We need help. It needs to be addressed from what the industry is, what it has been, not create a new industry for the mega operations.
Thank you. Speaker 1.
Ross Gordon, California Growers Association. Just wanted to speak to briefly the regulations that came out about, 19 days ago or whatever, that the comment period just closed for. I think I'm not sure if now or the previous item or the next item is the best time to talk about that, but it does seem important to sort of acknowledge those, and that I think from our perspective, those were extremely impactful changes that happened over a very short period of time. And thinking from y'all's perspective that y'all spent so much time in subcommittees in March, trying to figure out how you felt about all these regulations, and now we're 3 whatever regulatory packages down the road, and all this stuff is changing real quick, and a lot of it can seem very small and technical, but ends up being extremely impactful for our members and for the folks on the ground. So just to talk briefly to a couple of what those are. First, from CDFA's perspective, there is some new direction around shared spaces among folks who have multiple licenses. And there are a lot of people who have, say, a 5,000 square foot small mixed light license and a 5,000 square foot outdoor license, and they want to share things like their immature plant space or their processing space or their pesticide storage space that's not cultivation space. And these new regulations said they could share some spaces, but not other spaces, and notably said that you're not able to share your processing space, your packaging space, or your immature space. And this is something that can seem technical and minor, I think, if you're not out on farms, but from the farmer's perspective is extremely impactful. For processing in particular, you're talking about an F1 occupancy. There are very strict building code requirements. It's not really practical to build a processing facility once on the farm given the building code requirements. It's certainly not really practical to do it twice. So there are many other small things along those lines could talk about, but just want to at least bring people's attention to there are these regulations. They are really impactful, and please keep those in mind.
Thank you. If you have public comment on this agenda, please take one of the open seats at the front. Speaker 2, go ahead.
Jonathan Munoz on behalf of the California Police Use Association on the same topic of the recently proposed regulations that the comment period just closed on. We have concerns with the delivery regulation portion of it. I believe it was 541.6. We're concerned that regulation, which would allow regulations across county and city lines, undermines local control, which was one of the pillars of Prop 64. Our chiefs have expressed their concerns. Going back to what I said earlier about the enforcement side of it, when we haven't figured out this portion, we're allowing deliveries across the board. I know we've submitted letters, but I just wanted to put on the record that we have major concerns with that portion of the new regs. Thank you.
Thank you. No more public comment? Thank you.
Okay, we will move on to agenda item number 7, which is future agenda items. If anyone wants to add to our list that we have.
Okay. All right. I saw a couple days ago, or maybe yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, a press release from the Bureau of Cannabis Control announcing a solicitation for what I think is an outreach consultant or a public affairs firm to conduct a public education campaign, primarily around what licensing is, what it means, and why you as a consumer are better off shopping through the license chain. And so I want to give a kudos to the state for doing that. I think that's critically important. And so when the time is right, not next time, an update from the Bureau on that process, and when they've selected a vendor and they can disclose all that, an update from them would be great.
Excellent. Others?
Well, I'm going to repeat what Ms. Heidelbach-Teramoto said about security, and what I would recommend, even though we can't make it in a form of a motion today, is that we invite our are agencies responsible for worker protections under the federal law and under the state law, being the ALRB and the NLRB, to come and share with employers and anybody else who wants to listen what the rights of workers are and their right to organize, and how the state's right to having knowledge does not cannot exempt a worker's right to privacy when it comes to exercising their rights to organize. And so I think that would be a good venue if we could get somebody from the ALRB and the NLRB to come here and talk about how they're approaching that. I know we've been trying to approach that with different situations, and it would be good for everybody to hear it.
Okay, others?
Yeah, Keith Stevenson. I'd like to speak about enforcement in the retail space, whereas I firsthand know how difficult it is for retailers at the present time, licensed retailers. And I've read a press release from the BCC maybe 2 weeks ago that there was an illegal operator in Los Angeles who was caught with 500 pounds of flowers, 500 pounds of concentrates, 200 pounds of edibles, and it's a misdemeanor charge. I felt like maybe I was in the wrong space. And I honestly believe that the BCC has to have a firmer hand on the illegal market and illegal operators in order for this emerging market to really flourish. You know, there's too many dichotomies that exist in this space, and we need more symmetry.
Others on future agenda items?
I'd just like to suggest, at some point, I brought this up maybe in different forms, but the need to communicate more data. We're trying to make proposals on a lot of things, but we don't really have a way of knowing what's more important, right? And I know that over the next year through Fran, we're going to collect a lot of data, but all that is kind of private data. Right? It hasn't been said that it's going to be publicly disclosed, but I'd like to figure out, or I'd like to have BCC or some agency figure out at what point can we start taking this data and sharing it so that we can make better policy and know that we're doing the right things. I don't think that's talked about much.
Good point. Mr. Williams.
Considering that we're closing out the year and the January meeting is really going to be to kick off the new year, and there's going to be some obvious procedural stuff that we would have to go through, like the officer stuff, it'd be really great to get a State of the Union from the Bureau or all three agencies, kind of where we are, how many licenses been issued, licensing fees collected, just kind of reset the year and set in motion future. But as far as agenda items, that's one thing I would kind of want to see at the January hearing is a State of the Union from the Bureau.
Other comments or items? Okay, we'll move on to public comment on item number 7, future agenda items.
Go ahead, speaker 1.
Hi, this is Susan Tibbin. This is not opposite day. This is kind of beat it to death day, but we respectfully request that the CAC agendize a new cottage microbusiness license with particular emphasis on rural legacy small operators operating out of their home with the highest health and safety standards, obviously, inspections, obviously, but this addresses really the thousands and thousands of people who are waiting, who are desperate to enter the market and are just being shut out. If all of the people that we have referenced were to fill this room, there would not be enough seats. It would be a meeting similar to our new governor's Blue Ribbon Committee 3 years ago meeting in Garberville, where it was an overflow crowd of excited, eager, a little bit of trepidation, but ready to do it. And look at today. We would like to see that meeting in January filled with legacy farmers who know that you will advocate for us, as you have been doing. So please agendize that. Thank you.
Thank you. One
Well,
second. Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, Paul Hansberry. Obviously, I'd like to echo what Susan had just had to say, but a couple of other things. I've noticed that in the enforcement part, especially with distributors, it's come to my attention that there's quite a few small cultivators that have spent their entire life savings getting a license because this is what they feel they need to do. And they're making their first legal transactions with the license. And one of them, she sold 60 pounds of trim. After taxes, she realized $14, which takes me to the distributors and enforcement. I don't know if the Bureau has the ability to do this or if it has to be a civil matter, but there's a number of cases where the distributors are not paying the farmers. So after going through all of this, they take that, they collect the cultivation tax, and they're not paid. The farmers are left there after this, after spending their life savings, and it's just heartbreaking. I don't know if that can be written into the code as an enforcement issue, as a minor violation or a major violation for them if they're not paying their people, if there's a timely manner for them to pay their suppliers. But I mean, it's tough enough without people pulling that kind of stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Looks like then a public comment for that, Anna.
All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you all.